Hey everyone, it's Tony with Hidden Light Photography, and today we're going to be building on the reading guiding graphs video by learning about potential guiding issues and their possible causes. So if you haven't done so yet, hit that subscribe button. I don't want you to miss out on any valuable information. Now let's jump on in and learn about possible guiding issues and their potential causes. Now that we know what a guiding graph shows us, why it behaves the way it does, and how to set our expectations, it's time to jump into what to look for when things don't go exactly as expected. Our guiding graphs tell a story, not with words, but with behaviors. When a guiding session doesn't go as planned, our guiding graphs will tell us the story of what happened so we can fix what went wrong. You just need to know how to read that story, which is what we're about to learn. A quick tip to keep in mind, if you don't already have PhD2 Log Viewer, I would recommend downloading it, as this will save your guide logs to a dedicated folder for future investigation of your guiding sessions should you encounter an issue that needs to be diagnosed. To get PhD2 Log Viewer, simply go to the PhD2 homepage, scroll all the way to the bottom, and click the link shown. This will bring you to a page where you can click the download based on your operating system. On a side note, if you haven't seen my video on reading guiding graphs, make sure to check it out. I'll have a link to my reading guiding graphs video in the description of this video. Before we get started, it's important to understand that nothing is ever perfect. And as high precision as guiding is no exception to that rule. In your experience with guiding, you'll see random excursions or jumps in the guiding graph for either RA or declination or both. This graph here shows an example of a random jump in RA. This type of behavior isn't something to worry about or stress over as long as the guiding before and after the excursion was normal. However, it'll most likely need to be addressed at some point. The time to worry is when this type of behavior happens frequently throughout a session, or guiding is less than ideal prior to or after the excursion spike. Some possible causes of a random excursion like this would include, but not limited to, a small temporary snag of a cable, sudden gust of wind, something bumping the telescope, or even the mount sticking for a brief moment. Again, if guiding is good before and after, and you only have one, maybe two of these spikes, I wouldn't worry too much. Just double check your cabling to ensure there's no snag points and your mount moves freely throughout the entire range of motion. Let's examine this graph here. We see our blue RA line and our red declination line. Another piece of the graph we see are red and blue rectangles, and the rectangles vary in length. What are those rectangles, and what do they mean? In the previous video, we learned the motion of the blue RA line represents the motion of the guide star in RA relative to the guide star starting point, and the motion of the red declination line represents the motion of the guide star in declination relative to the guide star starting point. We also learned the guiding software sends guiding commands to the mount in the opposite direction of the guide star motion for each axis. If we look, we see the rectangles are on the opposite side of the RA and declination graph spikes. From this information, we can conclude the rectangles are the guide commands sent by the guiding software to the mount. The blue rectangles are the RA axis guide commands, and the red rectangles are the declination axis guide commands. Can you guess what the different lengths of the rectangles mean? If you said the length represents the strength of the guide command, you're absolutely correct. Does this represent good guiding? For the most part, yes. One very important takeaway here is don't fall into the trap of thinking a lot of motion and activity on a graph means guiding is horrible. That's not necessarily the case at all. Think back to my reading guiding graphs video and how I showed the RMS statistics. The RMS statistics tell the entire story. Why would a bouncy graph with a lot of activity still yield good guiding? If you're on an airplane and experience a lot of turbulence, does that make the pilot any less skilled? No. Turbulence is completely out of the pilot's control and does not determine the skill the pilot possesses. There's one factor that's sometimes overlooked when guiding, and that's seeing conditions, or the turbulence of our atmosphere. Have you looked at the moon through a telescope, either video or through an eyepiece? Have you noticed the image looks wavy? That's seeing conditions. The worse the seeing, the more wavy or turbulent the atmosphere is. Haven't looked at the moon through a telescope yet? That's okay. Have you looked at a hot barbecue grill and noticed everything immediately above is really distorted? Better yet, have you noticed some nights stars twinkle more than other nights? You guessed it, the more they twinkle, the worse the seeing conditions. If you haven't noticed, you will now. Let's re-examine the question of how can a bouncy and active guiding graph still yield good guiding. If you notice the twinkling stars, so does your guide camera. The stars twinkle because of the atmospheric turbulence, and that distorts the image exactly like a hot barbecue grill. Those distortions amplify the apparent movement of the guide star, and what happens when the guide star moves? The graph moves accordingly, and guide commands are sent to the mount for counteractive corrections based on the settings, which we'll get into in the next video, tying this into a nice bow. It's easy to put together now that the worse the seeing, the worse the atmospheric turbulence, and the more the guide star apparent movement is, which all comes together to mean more graph and guide command activity. Looking at this graph, you'll see that even though it isn't the prettiest graph, most movements are within 1 arc second. Seeing something like this graph is when you would watch your total RMS, and if it's within your acceptable range, the graph aesthetics don't matter. Total RMS is the final judge of your guiding no matter what. There are times when seeing is just too bad to get good guiding though, and this is where you need to make a judgment call of if you'll accept the guiding you're currently getting, or pack it away for the night and try again another night. And we'll learn ways to adjust your settings to help compensate some of these effects in the next video. Let's take a look at this graph here, and let's think back to the first rule. Nothing is perfect. This graph represents perfect guiding. There's no deviations and no guide commands being issued. Fortunately, this is a pretty easy one to figure out. Can you guess what it is? Your guiding software locked onto a hot pixel. Some safeguards to take to prevent this is allow PhD2 to choose your guide star, use a dark library or hot pixel map, and if you want, use a 2x2 or 3x3 noise reduction map located in the brain dialog under Camera tab. Let's take a look at this scenario. Guiding started good, but then RA took a big turn and never returned. Notice how the guiding software sent constant, continuous commands to the RA axis, but RA never responded or recovered. Since the guiding software was sending commands and tracking the motion of the guide star in the affected axis, we can be confident that the guiding software is working as it should. This means that the mount was not receiving the guide commands. The solution? There's a few possible causes which are extremely rare, and the most common fail point are cables. A bad cable will cause the mount to not receive the guide commands. Swap to a known good cable, and if the issue resolves, replace the cable. Here's a rare issue, but good to know nonetheless. Here we see RA guiding quite well. However, declination is drifting north with no signs of recovery. With that said, we have a drift like we did in the last example. So is this another bad cable? Take a close look and you'll see there's no guide commands being generated by the guiding software. This means that the guiding software does not see the northern drift as an issue. The solution? In the settings, declination guide mode was set to north only. Changing this setting to auto or south would fix this issue. Can you guess what's happening here? Notice the unresponsiveness of the declination axis during directional changes. If we follow this graph, we see a series of guide commands pulling declination north, and then declination overshoots the starting position where it takes another series of south guide commands before the declination axis responds and starts coming back south. Can you guess what would cause delays in an axis directional change? If you guessed backlash, you're 100% correct. The declination axis will almost always be the axis that suffers from backlash issues. We see the graph behave this way because as the guiding software is commanding declination to go north, the gears have to take up the excess space between the teeth, called backlash, before the gears make contact and start moving the mount. Then the mount makes it to the starting position, but now it overshoots because the excess space between the teeth is on the opposite side and needs to be taken up again before the mount can stabilize. In some cases, we get into a back and forth battle that never recovers like you see here. Backlash is required in order for the gears within a mount to operate without getting damaged. However, in bad cases, an adjustment may be necessary. Another compensation method is to balance your declination axis more tail heavy. And if you're using PhD2, you can use the declination backlash compensation feature as long as the physical backlash is not too large. If the physical backlash is too large for backlash compensation within PhD2 and backlash adjustment on the mount is not possible, you may need to resort to guiding in one direction only in declination. Another thing to consider, if you end up guiding declination in only one direction, think about the scenario where declination was drifting and PhD2 was not responding because it did not see the drift as an issue. If you run into that, you may need to switch the direction that PhD2 guides declination in order to compensate for a drift. Here's a similar scenario for you. Notice we're now on the RA axis, and just like the previous example, we're bouncing back and forth, only this time from east to west. Is this another example of backlash? Not quite. Unlike the previous example with declination, where even though we're going north to south in declination, there is a randomness to it. Notice in this RA example, it's very pattern-like. There's almost a steadiness to it, and it's a consistent east to west error, almost like a sine wave. Can you guess what it is? If you said periodic error, great job. Almost all mounts suffer from periodic error to some degree. As we track across the night sky, RA does the work. Declination should almost never have to move. It will, but hardly. RA is east to west and does 100% of the tracking. With that said, there's that pesky rule again. Nothing is perfect, and that includes our RA gearing. Periodic error is the imperfections of our RA gearing, and it shows as a pattern like you see here, because it'll happen every time our RA worm gear makes a full revolution, which is an average of about 8 to 10 minutes depending on the mount. This is an example of a very large periodic error, and this large periodic error is causing PhD2 to fall behind on the guide star movements and not recover. The good news is most mounts are able to do what is called PEC training, or periodic error correction training. You run a PEC training for your mount for as long as you can, and this learns the behavior of your mount's periodic error, so your guiding software can predict when the periodic error will happen and send out a guide command early, which will smooth out and compensate for that periodic error. We'll cover PEC training in another video. If PEC training is not an option, try shortening your guiding exposure times, as this will help your guiding software stay ahead of the guide star movements rather than fall behind. So what do you think is going on in this example? As you can see, this is the declination axis. We see all guide commands are large, frequent, and in the same direction, but just not getting the job done. Declination just won't stay in the starting position. If you're saying, Tony, that's polar alignment, you're absolutely correct. Guide commands in the same direction isn't necessarily bad for declination, but as we can see, the guide commands are large, frequent. Declination is wanting to come back to the starting position, but just won't stay there. The fact that the axis is responding to the guide commands but keeps drifting off is the giveaway that this is polar alignment related. As a side note, this isn't just restricted to the declination axis. You can also see the same behavior in RA, and that would also indicate polar alignment issue. Have you ever heard the phrase chasing the seeing? This is a perfect example of what chasing the seeing means. Notice how every exposure results in a guide command which reverses the direction of the guide star each and every time. This results in no stability in the axis and is a direct result of seeing conditions. Remember, as seeing conditions worsen, that means more turbulence in the atmosphere, which also affects the perceived motion of the guide star. Ideally, you want times where the graph moves and no guide command is issued. This allows stability in the axis. If you run into this, try increasing the MinMo setting, which will cause your guiding software to allow more forgiveness in the perceived motion of the guide star before issuing a guide command. This means a decrease in the number of guide commands issued. You can also try increasing your guide camera exposure time. Here, we see a heavy oscillation in declination. Can you tell me why this is not backlash? Notice the sharp, almost instantaneous responses for each guide command. If this were backlash, we would see slower reactions to the guide commands. This could be caused by one of a couple of issues. Remember, bad seeing conditions can cause a bouncier graph, and it's easy to overcorrect for that. When it comes to declination, it's important to remember that declination is the axis that generally holds the backlash issues, and also should almost never run. Any corrections that are made should be subtle and graceful. When you get into some tougher seeing conditions, setting a smaller MinMo to try to control the graph as it gets bouncy will lead to what you're seeing here. If you get this, try increasing the MinMo setting, as this will alleviate corrections being made on the axis. This strange phenomena you see here is a very interesting one. It would almost be easy to think that it's stiction, as the axis is staying put before it starts going back. However, notice there are no guide commands while the declination axis is sitting off-center. The guiding software is issuing a command which is overshooting the starting point, and then the axis is staying put with no commands until the guiding software decides that the star will not correct its location. Once the guiding software decides the star will not correct, a guide command is issued and the cycle starts over. This is due to backlash compensation being set within the mount itself, thus fighting with the guiding software. If you experience this, set the backlash compensation in your mount itself to 0, and this should clear the issue. On a side note, I have found with a Celestron AVX mount using CPWY, there is a tracking setting for both RA and declination. If you experience a similar issue to this, try setting that to RA only, as this can alleviate this type of issue as well. Now for our last scenario. This one looks pretty scary, but can you guess what it is? If you said backlash, you are correct. However, that's only half the story. We have the telltale signs of backlash, as we can see the delay from the time guide commands start to when the mount actually responds, and then the mount overshoots the starting position. However, notice what happens when the mount finally does respond to the guide commands. There's a sudden jump in declination. This is due to a condition known as stiction. What happens is when the gears finally mesh again, the axis motor hits a form of static friction called stiction, and the energy builds as the axis motor tries to overcome the friction. Finally, the resistance is overcome and the energy that is built up is suddenly released, which shoves the mount in an aggressive, sudden manner the direction it was trying to move, resulting in the sudden, sharp movement we see in the declination graph here. A first step is to reduce the backlash as much as possible, but you will need to identify the source of the stiction and correct as needed to overcome this scenario. I hope that you found this useful. If you did, do me a favor. That channel icon that popped up, hit that channel icon and subscribe. I don't want you to miss out on any valuable information. Drop a comment in the comment section. Did you learn anything new? What questions do you have? And then check out that next video. Until the next time, clear skies.